a pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Joe Carew, who's a native of Newfoundland and a graduate of Memorial University. In fact, he was my first student here at Memorial University, my first grad student, many years ago. He wrote a wonderful dissertation on Zizek. It was so good that it was published. So I don't know anyone else who published his MA thesis besides Joseph Carew, but there you go. He's published his MA thesis and then went on to McGill to work on an exceptional piece of work on Hegel's logic, which is still being prepared for publication. He's been quite busy teaching. He's at the University of the Fraser Valley and editing. He's edited many works, including the forthcoming, much anticipated, monumental, earth-shaking, world-changing Palgrave Companion to Schelling. In the works since the dark days of the pandemic.
Dark days, yeah.
Along with Kyla Bruff and myself. And currently has found himself another reason not to finish his Hegel manuscript,
I know, right?
Which is he's translating Friedrich Schlegel's 1801 Lectures on Transcendental Philosophy. I guess we're going to get a little glimpse into that world.
Definitely getting a little glimpse into that world. So yeah, I guess I'll just jump in. The full title of the talk is Stewards of Nature's Infinite Life, Friedrich Schlegel's Environmental Philosophy. So when Schlegel began to develop his romantic conception of nature at the turn of the 19th century, two significant shifts in the human-nature relationship had already occurred in the history of Western thought, both brought about by the rise of modernity. On the one hand, the modern paradigm of science had long since triumphed over the Aristotelian medieval paradigm. Its new quantitative methods entailed that the pre-modern conception of nature as structured by inner principles of change and constituting a well-ordered whole replete with intrinsic purpose had given way to the modern conception of nature as governed by ironclad laws of cause and effect, and, in the words of Galileo, written in the language of mathematics. On the other hand, a new idealism had recently turned the philosophical milieu upside down in the worlds of Fichte. This idealism, distinctly modern by placing human freedom at the center stage of its system, proclaimed the unbridgeable chasm between the self-determined human world of meaning and the deterministic natural world of meaningless processes. In the first shift, nature became a machine lacking vitality and purpose, whereas in the second shift, vitality and purpose became properly ascribable only to human existence. Schlegel's romantic conception of nature is a response to these two shifts in the human-nature relationship in modernity, through which nature becomes a mere object. I will construct his position in 3 steps. First, Schlegel criticizes modernity for disenchanting nature by robbing nature of its wonder and mystery, and, in so doing, for entrenching an instrumentalist view of nature, of which Fichte's idealism is but the logical expression. Second, Schlegel combats the existential problem of our alienation from nature that arises from modernity's disenchantment by re-enchanting nature. Schlegel views it as a godlike cosmic organism. Godlike because nature is eternally self-forming, form-giving, and boundlessly creative. And a cosmic organism because in nature, all things are interwoven parts in the greater whole that is the universe, like organs in a body, whereby each thing, like nature itself, is sacred and alive in its own right. Third, while Schlegel here does undo anthropocentrism with this gesture, he still assigns us human beings a unique vocation to become stewards of nature's infinite life, with stark implications for how we should relate to the environment. So, part 1, Schlegel's critique. Schlegel's critique of modernity focuses on its characteristic form of discursive rationality, what he calls the understanding, which is at work par excellence in its paradigm of science, and the 3 main features of which impact how we view or frame nature. First, the understanding is analytic in the sense that it divides nature, or it divides its object into standalone elements, as a consequence of which the holistic unity of nature vanishes from sight as soon as it is set to work. Quote, the isolating understanding begins by dividing the whole of nature and breaking it up into singularized items, end quote. Second, the understanding searches for causal laws that govern these elements. Laws that, because in principle quantifiable in mathematical formulas, quote, treat nature as a machine, end quote. Third, these two operations of the understanding result in the so-called scientific rationalization of nature. The expectation that, quote, the whole world become comprehensible, end quote. In short, since the understanding is what he calls a process of dismemberment, modern science focuses exclusively on individualized natural phenomena, typically in profound, sophisticated, nuanced detail, but can only piece these phenomena together into a larger picture as a mechanical system, one that, while fully intelligible and hence also fully predictable, is also incapable of grasping any deeper unity or interconnectedness of nature. However, Schlegel's critique gets at more than how modernity compels us to conceptualize nature as a mechanical system without any deeper unity and interconnectedness. It also brings about for Schlegel a loss in our experience of nature, a point he makes by highlighting the diametrical opposition between the ancients and the moderns on nature. In ancient mythology, nature is portrayed as an enchanted world. It is not just an object of cognition whose clockwork is laid bare by causal inference and calculation. It is also, and more primordially, a world populated by deities, wherein natural phenomena are ruled over by them, are forms that they can assume or are simply consecrated. Demeter controls the fertility of the earth. Poseidon takes the form of a horse. Artemis holds deer as sacred. This means that for the ancients, nature could not, given the freedom of the gods that its phenomenon incarnate, be made fully intelligible. Nor could it be fully predicted, and certainly could not be used according to our whims and inclinations. There was always something wondrous and mysterious about it, nay, even an aura of divinity that demanded reverence. But modern science, of course, struck the death blow to the ancient conception of nature, reducing nature to an aggregate of individualized phenomenon governed by mechanical causal laws, couched in mathematical formulas. Its quantitative methods left no room for the wondrous and the mysterious in our experience of nature. The shift to modernity effectuates, by definition, for Schlegel, the disenchantment of nature. While in the origin story modernity tells of itself, this disenchantment is presented as the hallmark of progress, of reason's surpassing of superstition. For Schlegel, it also presents a dire existential problem. As soon as nature loses its wonder and mystery, we become alienated from it. We lose our emotional, cultural, and spiritual connection to it as something greater than our human concerns, but to which we belong. We no longer live in a natural world imbued with the presence of divinity, something worthy of our reference. We live in a meaningless environment, a mere object. Put differently, in the aftermath of modernity's reign, nature turns into something radically other to us, a mere machine that just exists with no vitality or purpose. In such a framework, nature can only be experienced theoretically as an object of cognition and practically as the brute background of human existence. We see this explicitly in Fichte's doctrine of science, one of the great tendencies of the age, as Schlegel designates it, alongside the French Revolution and Goethe's and William Meister. A key problem of Fichte's doctrine of science is how to unify the two aforementioned and seemingly heterogeneous dimensions of experience, that of the theoretical cognition of the natural world and that of practical action. To do so, Fichte demonstrates that the condition of possibility of both dimensions derives from the same first principle, the absolute freedom of the I, or the human subject. In Fichte's narrative of how human experience originates, the I, or the subject, first discovers in some primordial encounter its freedom checked by some other that, as it were, contingently stream-rolls over it. An encounter that sets up the twin tasks of becoming conscious of what this other is via the use of the understanding, and transforming this other so that it can become a medium conducive to, rather than limiting, the realization of its freedom, effectively synthesizing the two dimensions of experience. Fichte's point is that were it not for our freedom and our practical interest in realizing it, we would not engage in gaining knowledge of the natural world at all. Ultimately, theory, knowledge of the natural world, is subservient to practice. Fichte's idealism, therefore, bifurcates reality into two opposing ontological domains: the self-determined human world of meaning and the deterministic natural world of meaningless processes. When viewed through the lens of human activity, nature is interpreted as a necessary reservoir of resources for the pursuit of its practical interests, but also as a hostile force that can threaten it. In this respect, his idealism not only encourages the instrumentalization of nature as part of the vocation of humankind to realize its freedom, but actually demands it as the condition of the possibility of realizing our freedom. And Fichte makes this as clear as day in an extremely long passage that I have actually excerpted here, but this is a pretty big quote. So Fichte says, and I quote, "Cultivated lands shall animate and moderate the inert and hostile atmosphere of primeval forests, deserts, and swamps. Science shall later penetrate into the invariable laws of nature more thoughtfully and calmly, and learn to calculate or predict its possible developments, while remaining close to living and acting nature and following in its footsteps. We shall conceive of a new nature. In this way, nature is to become ever more transparent to us until we can see into its most secret core, and human power, enlightened and armed by its discoveries, shall control it without effort." End quote. So in this respect, modern idealism, with its instrumentalist view of nature, proves to be the reverse side of the coin of the disenchantment of nature effectuated by modern science. It reveals the two are intertwined in the logic of modernity itself, something already hinted at by Descartes in 1637, who claims that modern science will permit, and I quote, "to make ourselves, as it were, the masters and possessors of nature," end quote. So for Schlegel, therefore, modernity entails the disenchantment of nature, which in turn entails our alienation from and subsequent instrumentalization of nature. But he goes actually one step further. Reflecting on the new idealism of his age, he offers a diagnosis of this alienation that is as prescient as it is urgent, predicting the crossroads to which it will lead us. This is a quote which is written in 1801, 1 year after Fichte wrote that beautiful passage. "This idealism is yet only a mode of expression of the phenomenon of all phenomena, that humanity struggles with all of its power to find its own center." And here's the kicker: humanity must, as things stand, either perish or be rejuvenated. So the modern conception of nature for Schlegel, for all its intellectual gains and technological advances and whatnot, can, if pushed to the extreme, cause our ecological suicide. Says this in 1801. So, part two, Schlegel's alternative. So Schlegel's warning does not issue from a nostalgia for some golden age of antiquity. Instead of abandoning modernity, it is actually just a call to re-enchant nature from within it. As he puts it, we must, quote, enchant the mind, end quote, to allow it to see the wondrous and mysterious once again. Here's another quote. It is time we get serious about the mind awakening and reclaiming the wand of enchantment that has been lost, end quote. In so doing, we not only gain insight into the deeper unity and interconnectedness of nature that modern science is blind to, we also change our very attitude towards nature. To this end, Schlegel charges Romanticism with the task of cultivating what he calls a sense for the infinite that has been eclipsed by the modern mindset. So for Schlegel, the infinite is just another word for the whole of nature. The understanding may have made great strides in explaining the forces of matter, the laws of chemical bonding, the immensity of geological time, and even the processes of life itself. But what escapes it is just the deeper unity and interconnectedness that's implied and even needed for him by its findings. He thinks that once we gain such an appreciation for this deeper unity and interconnectedness, we see the truth of the following proposition, quote, the universe is an artwork, an animal, a plant, end quote. Schlegel's speculative reasoning in a nutshell is something like this. There is, as he says, only one world. Knowledge is therefore knowledge of nature. The only science is natural science, philosophy included. As such, when we survey the formations of the earth and the heavens as described by modern science, and he's very explicit about this, we need modern science to make this next gesture. When we look at all these findings with an eye to how they come together in an interwoven whole, we witness what he calls the fullness of life of creative nature. For what brings all these formations into a being and counts for the order that they display, the interconnected order, has to be nature itself. There is nothing outside it. There is only one world. So therefore, we encounter in artistic terms the, quote, infinite play of the universe, the work of art which eternally creates itself anew, end quote. Nature itself is a great unconscious artist whose creation, the very body of the artist itself, is forever incomplete because always in progress. In philosophical terms, this is cashed out in the theses that nature is a great cosmic organism, a plant, an animal, with an inbuilt formative drive that impels it to grow and evolve without cease. Moreover, since there is nothing beyond nature, nature itself is therefore eternally self-forming, that which gives forms to all things, and boundlessly creative, which makes nature, for all intents and purposes, God-like. As Schlegel is wont to put it, therefore, nature is, quote, a divinity in becoming, end quote. So Schlegel's romantic conception of nature is therefore not just organicist, but explicitly pantheistic. So, no surprise here. Taking inspiration from Spinoza, Schlegel makes a distinction between nature in its finite and infinite dimensions. There's the dimension of nature we are most familiar with, the various discrete natural phenomena that we empirically observe, or natured, natura naturata. But such only come into being for Schlegel insofar as they are produced by the underlying productivity of living nature itself, nature naturing, or natura naturans. The re-enchant nature for Schlegel, therefore, is to learn to see how each discrete natural phenomenon indicates, as he puts it, the freedom and creativity of nature itself. Put differently, we must gain cognizance of the fact that everything in the natural world is ontologically a symbol or allegory of nature's infinite life. This distinction implies two things of note vis-a-vis modern science. The first is that modern science must be fused with art if it is to cultivate a sense for the infinite. Put differently, we must recognize that art has a scientific even truth functional value when applied in certain domains. All knowledge is symbolic, Schlegel says, precisely insofar as all natural entities indicate the infinite life of nature. They are actually symbols, therefore. But since our poetry in particular deals with the symbolic and allegorical, it alone is uniquely in a position to supplement the limitations of modern science's new quantitative methods by enabling us to see how all natural phenomena, even those described by modern science, do come together to form a living whole and are bursting with some hidden meaning as soon as we learn how to recognize it. Hence, Schlegel says, if you want to penetrate into the heart of physics, then let yourself be initiated into the mysteries of poetry. The second is that to cultivate a sense for the infinite is to recover a sense of the wondrous and the mysterious. The natural world around us recovers its vitality and purpose. Everything within it, absolutely everything, a rock, a sea, a tree, a bear, a sea urchin, to use Sean's example, is therefore a revelation of nature's infinite life, has a spark of its freedom and creativity within it, and has some role to play within that, even if we don't know explicitly what it is. Schlegel's distinction also implies two things of note vis-a-vis modern idealism. First, it strikes at the heart of its bifurcation of reality into a human world filled with vitality and purpose, and a natural world devoid of both, and also the alienation that this bifurcation brings forth. When one learns to read the infinite poem of nature, as he puts it, the poem which no other human poem compares with and of which they are actually just a part, one must grant that it is the whole of nature that is unconditionally free. Godlike, it alone is eternally self-forming and boundlessly creative, a spontaneous but unconscious force that gives rise to all things. It alone is self-contained, self-governing, and self-determining. The human being, as a product of nature's productivity, can only have, as he puts it, a relative freedom vis-a-vis nature itself. Our freedom is secondary and derived, something gifted to us that we only possess insofar as we participate in and have a share in its more primordial freedom. But there's here nothing special about the human being. The mineral, the botanical, the animal, you name it, everything in its own way also participates in and has a share in the more primordial freedom of nature. Each entity thus displaying vitality and purpose. Second, if everything is alive insofar as it contains, expresses, and develops the divine spark of nature's infinite life, nature is not radically other to us, the mere background of human existence. The entire universe, as well as everything in it, is a kindred spirit to which we should feel connected emotionally, culturally, and so on, because we're all organs of one great cosmic organism. We should cooperate as the organs of our body do. This necessitates that nothing should ever be treated instrumentally for Schlegel. All natural phenomena are, in their own way, sacred, such that nature is not a reservoir of resources to be exploited or a hostile force to tame. Nature ought to be an object of reverence. Put differently, our basic attitude toward it should not be one of use, but what he calls love. And here's a beautiful quote from him. Whoever fails to get acquainted with nature through love will never get acquainted with it. And in the next fragment, he defines what he means by love, and he gives a bunch of descriptors. And some of them are humility, devotion, loyalty, gratitude. That is the basic attitude we should have to nature. So let's get into the third part here, Schlegel's new romantic imperative. So in this way, Schlegel's re-enchantment of nature also obviously renaturalizes the human being, effectively undercutting anthropocentrism. Our freedom is derivative of and dependent on nature's more primordial freedom, different only in degree and not in kind from other phenomena. Nevertheless, interestingly, his romantic conception of nature still entails a certain kind of human exceptionalism. On the one hand, as that place in nature where nature's own infinite life comes to the fore in a finite being, because we are radically free in our own creativity and so on. So here we are, nature's freedom itself raised to a higher potency. A part of the poet, a spark of his creative spirit lives in us, as Schlegel says. On the other hand, as Schlegel says, humanity is nature creatively looking back on itself, end quote, making us the prize and perhaps exclusive medium of nature, whereby nature becomes conscious of itself. But Schlegel does admit the possibility of other worlds with other lives of which we know nothing. So this is just as far as we know. So, but for Schlegel, more than being just a pinnacle of nature's development and a vehicle of its self-knowledge, humanity is not just a sui generis product amongst others of nature's productivity. A special role is also bestowed upon it. The vocation of the human being is to be what he calls the stewards of nature's infinite life by assisting in the realization of its divinity. So what does he really mean by that concretely? Well, as for Schlegel's reconceptualization of the human-nature relationship, this signals, in fact, that environmental concerns are not peripheral to human life, but actually at its very center. As Schlegel puts it, ethics, politics, and religion should be interwoven. Because philosophy should, as he puts it, refer to the human being taken as a whole, his organicism and pantheism constitute not just a metaphysics, but also a religious way of life. But this new religion, like religion itself, is, quote, only possible insofar as the human being loses their individuality and elevates themselves above their own existence, end quote. Accordingly, we must, for Schlegel, raise ourselves above our anthropocentric interests and gain insight into our subordinated place in what he just refers to as nature as an organism. So I'll focus on the ethics part of this in short detail. In terms of ethics for Schlegel, this entails that while ethical life is an individual affair in which each individual exercises autonomy to decide what is good for them and so on, we are all in possessions of our own ideals, as he likes to put it, there is always an external check on this autonomy. All ethical maxims reduce, quotation marks there, to the following two demands. And here's a quote. One, the first axiom, get acquainted with yourself, explore your ideal, and whatever stands in the way of your striving for that ideal. The second, live in accordance with nature or follow nature. These are the only two maxims you need to be ethical. So this brings with it a radical revision of the meaning of a virtuous life, which Schlegel is very explicit about. Virtue is not living a balanced and fulfilled life, as it may be for Aristotle, or acting dutifully, as it may be for Kant. It requires us to exist in a bond with the natural world, both by living harmoniously within it and participating in its creation by recognizing and assisting the divinity of everything around us. Only in doing so can we fulfill our vocation of being the stewards of nature's infinite life. Ethics for Schlegel, therefore, has a quintessentially egocentric dimension just built into it. To be virtuous is to act in the name of the good of the whole of nature, to be its protector and aid. Here's a quote. Virtue is the condition where a human being commits themselves with the whole force of their being behind them to the good of the whole. This is because I take it that given our distinctive capacities, we can make a difference in nature where it counts. That might even just be by preventing ourselves from doing further damage to it or whatever. And here's a beautiful quote. Human virtue possesses the force to spread itself across the whole, to intervene in it, and to affect its development. End quote. So a similar set of conditions play themselves out in politics for Schlegel. I will not dwell on them because it's largely the thing. The basic idea seems to be that The body politic is a whole in and of itself and should be treated as such. We shouldn't treat humans as, individual atoms with, things to protect. They're all part of a greater community, but that community itself is part of a greater community. The body politic is part of the cosmic body of nature. So these things have to be intertwined in some sense. And there is a nice quote here to this effect. This philosophy rests on the concept of the organism of nature. This concept always also carries over into practical philosophy, end quote. So part and parcel of Schlegel's romantic reenchantment of nature is therefore a new romantic imperative. The old romantic imperative being to poeticize the world, as Novalis puts it. His goal is not to just reawaken the mind to nature's wonder and mystery, but to change our very behavior. And here's his actual imperative. Just as nature organizes itself, so too organize yourself, end quote. So nature is an infinite life, a godlike cosmic organism that, while free in its internal self-forming and inexhaustible in its boundless creativity, also does obey certain what he calls formative and organic laws. So analogous to how the biology of an organism dictates the norm of what is good and bad for it, what counts as sickness and health, what counts as a specimen and monster of the species, nature itself stipulates what's good and bad for it through its own internal logic. In this manner, Schlegel urges us not merely to relate to one another by treating humanity as an end in itself or doing what is best for our practical pursuits, but to relate to nature in such a way that our actions have always what is conducive to its prosperous development in consideration. This is not a simple afterthought. It is the heart of the human vocation of being the stewards of nature's infinite life. We are called to care and guide nature's creations and nature itself to ensure that we are not a cancer cannibalizing its energy and wreaking havoc on its inside to sedate our own egotism. So a brief little conclusion here. So some lessons we can learn. So it is worth, by way of consideration, to address the fact that Schlegel's romantic conception of nature was developed at a time when the German-speaking states were facing an ecological crisis. During the 17th and 18th century, the wood required as raw materials for urbanization and various industries, especially mining, led to the ravaging of the forests, resulting in a so-called wood emergency. Anxiety about the finitude of this crucial natural resource issued in numerous works campaigning against the overexploitation of the land. It is in this context, in 1713, that Hans Carl von Carlowitz, a mine administrator, coined the term sustainability in the first treatise of contemporary forestry to refer to the careful management of the natural resource. Such discussions made their way to the courts, a move that has led some to see this episode as an early instance of environmental awakening. In short, cognizance of the deadly human impact on the natural world was on the rise, and the dangers of this the romantics would thematize in art and philosophical reflections more and more and more and more, as the 19th century progressed. So my question is, what would Schlegel have to say about such talk and its contemporary expressions? What is striking about this new discourse around sustainable forestry of the period is that it examines forests in, well, modern scientific terms. It is a product of the Enlightenment and the Enlightenment understanding of nature. As such, for Schlegel, it falls prey to his own critique of modernity by default. By taking forests as an object to cognize, open the causal inference and calculation, it turns them into mere objects that are fully intelligible and predictable, at least in principle. But nature for Schlegel has a life and hence a freedom of its own So he would warn that it's probably folly to believe that we can wholly comprehend and control the forests and therefore learn to manipulate them intelligently. Moreover, the motivation behind the science at its very foundation is clear. It takes forests as a natural resource that must be used rationally, for otherwise we put our anthropocentric interests in jeopardy, where population growth and economic gain are the principal driving forces. There is no awe for the wonder and mystery of the ecosystems of the forests here, the function that they play even in life as a whole, and there's certainly no reverence for their hidden divinity. It's written by a mine, administrator, for God's sake, who just wants to keep the fuel coming kind of thing. So in other words, for Schlegel, the discourse of sustainability, whether in its classical or contemporary form, actually just amounts to a more enlightened version of the rationalization of nature we see in science, modern science, and the instrumentalization of nature we see in Descartes and Fichte. So basically, central to Schlegel's conception of nature is the rejection of any attempt to regulate our dealings with nature through a strictly modern framework. As soon as we treat nature as a mere object to be quantified, to be known, to be calculated, to be predicted, and so on, we actually lose sight of why it should be protected in the first place. Nature has a value of its own, totally independent of us, and for him, the sole way out of all the dangers that thereby arise from our alienation of nature. So the fact that as he puts it, the most sacred things will always have to remain nameless. That's the best case scenario. Of course, the worst case scenario is ecological crisis, whether it's ecological suicide of humanity or, the wood emergency. The only way out of all of this is to re-enchant nature in some shape or form. Only by learning to see once again its wonder and mystery, by acknowledging and stewarding its infinite life, can we effectively be, for Schlegel, environmentalists. In short, sustainability must be superseded by the reverence of nature as a divinity in becoming, with each of its products containing, expressing, and developing that divinity in a unique way. So rather than viewing human life as the most important thing and all other things as ultimately serviceable to it, every one of us must become, quote, someone who holds everything that acts, exists, and becomes as sacred, and who participates in and sympathizes with all life, period. So this is, I take it to be at least the key concrete takeaway of Schlegel's environmental philosophy. And that's all I have for you all.